Hello and welcome to this virtual session. We're glad you can join us today. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items we'd like to go over with you now. Firstly, you can resize the webinar windows to cater to your viewing preferences. You can maximize, minimize and drag the windows to your preferred viewing size. If you look at the bottom middle of your screen, you can click on the widgets that you'll need to get the most out of this virtual experience. Secondly, Microsoft specialists are on hand to answer your questions in real time. So feel free to type in your questions using the Q&A window and we'll answer them as soon as we can. Lastly, we've provided some additional resources for you to supplement your learning. You can access them by clicking on the links in this section. Without further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers.
Hello and welcome to Microsoft Security, Compliance, and Identity Fundamentals, also known as SC900. My name is Chelsea Lee, and I will be your Microsoft Technical Trainer over the next 2 sessions. I'm incredibly excited to be here with you today because security is an important topic, and it really needs to be top of mind for everyone in your organizations. Now, over the next 2 sessions, we'll be exploring different security, compliance, and identity solutions inside of M365, as well as Azure. Now, I do want to make sure that you remember that this is a fundamentals course. So our main focus is to introduce different concepts. And if you are planning on taking the SC900, which I hope you are, that you won't need to implement any of these solutions. Instead, you'll be focused on identifying and describing these solutions through different multiple choice questions. In order to pass, you'll need to score a minimum of 700 out of 1,000 potential points in order to receive that certificate. But just so you know, you're not losing points for incorrect answers. So, in my opinion, it's always worth to take an educated guess. But I don't want you to worry. I'm here to give you different tips, different tricks, all along our journey today that will hopefully help you in your studying. Now, one of the biggest pieces of advice that I can give you is take advantage of the free learning pass on Microsoft Learn. This course, which includes all of my slides today, are mapped directly one-to-one on Microsoft Learn. And you can find that learning path at aka.ms/scfunpath. Again, that's aka.ms/scfunpath. And I highly recommend that you bookmark that page because it's going to be handy to have over these next 2 sessions. It has links to Microsoft Docs as well as supplemental videos. And here's the thing what I really like it for. I like it for the knowledge checks at the end of each module. Because between this virtual training day that you're here with me today and the learning path, you're going to have everything that you need to pass your SC900 exam. Now, there are 4 modules in the SC900 course. We're going to cover 1 and 2 and half of Module 3 today. Then in Part 2, we're going to finish up the second half of Module 3 and wrap up with Module 4. Again, all of the material we'll cover over these next 2 sessions are in that learning path. So with that being said, why don't we go ahead and get started with Module 1, where we are going to be describing different concepts around security, compliance, and identity. Now, this is a nice short module, and we won't be looking at any specific Microsoft products, but rather we're going to be looking at different methodologies when it comes to security and compliance and some of the different attacks that you need to be on the lookout for. As a reminder, all of the content I'm sharing in my slides can be found on the learning path at aka.ms/scfunpath. So the first area that I want to focus on is some of the different terminology that you'll definitely see on the exam. But it's also something that you'll want to be familiar with in general. Because here's the thing. Data isn't just being accessed within the walls of your office anymore. I mean, you have folks working all over the place. And you and your organization need to know how to protect your data. And this brings us kind of to the overriding theme of any security solution, the zero trust methodology. This concept assumes that absolutely everything is open and an untrusted network, even your own corporate network. And the zero trust model follows the logic of trust no one and verify everything. Because, I mean, think of it. How much of your workforce is outside of your traditional corporate network? I mean, do you have any remote employees? Maybe you have any road warriors? Especially in recent times, there's a greater need to expand security just beyond your corporate network. But at the same time, you're still needing to provide access to the different resources and the different applications. And this is where the zero trust model comes in. This is where you are going to verify requests explicitly and give the least amount of access required to do the job. And then you need to assume breach. These three principles of zero trust support the 6 different foundational pillars that provide an end-to-end security solution. So first, you have your identities. This is where you need to make sure that you are verifying all identities and making sure that you have a strong authentication process. We'll discuss some more authentication techniques in Module 2. But the second pillar is we need to have your devices visible and we need to see them on your network. I mean, this even goes for bring your own devices. And for the third pillar, that ties right to your applications as well. Fourth pillar, your network. We want to make sure that you are segmenting your network and encrypting all of that internal communication. And with infrastructure, the fifth pillar, it's essential that you have real-time threat detection setup that is automatically blocking and flagging different risks. And then finally, we have the last pillar, one of your final lines of defense, your data. Now, while we have a number of different layers protecting your data, you still want to make sure that you are classifying, labeling, and encrypting your data when it's in transit or at rest. And when we talk about the layers of protecting your data, that's where we have what's called the defense in depth model. The entire purpose behind the defense in depth model is where we're actually leveraging a series of mechanisms to slow the advance of an attack that is trying to get unauthorized access to your data. Microsoft's goal, and I hope your goal too, is to ultimately protect your data. So if we actually look at the chart here on the screen, each layer provides protection so that even if one of these layers gets breached, the one right below is there to help prevent any type of further attack. This way, your data, your systems, they're not reliant on one layer of protection. So let's take a look at each layer. The physical security layer is providing secure access to the building. For example, any Microsoft data center is going to have multiple points of security just to get into the building. Whether it's swiping a badge or, they have skills that weigh you when you enter and when you exit. So everything on this level is focused on the physical security. Next, with the identity and access, which we're actually going to go more into detail in Module 2, but this is where you're double checking that the access is only granted to those who need it and only for what they need. The third level, the perimeter layer, this is where the goal is to prevent any unwanted users or services from accessing your network. A lot of times, your threats, they're getting stopped right here and they're not going any further. But we want to have alerts set up on the perimeter layer so you can investigate further. As we get into the next layer, the networking layer, this is where once an attack's in, you're going to want to make sure that you're limited the access to the different resources. So that way, if there is an attack, it's not spreading to the rest of your services. Now, with the compute layer, Patch Tuesday? It's actually one of the things that you do to protect your environment. You want to make sure that all of your systems are properly secured and you have the right controls in place. The application layer, well, this is where your developers need to integrate security into the design, so that way the application is secure by default. And at the final layer, even though all of these other layers are in place to protect it, you still want to make sure that those who have access to your data are responsible for securing it and storing it properly, and they're adhering to the compliance requirements that are really put in place to help protect it. The defense in depth is the approach that actually Microsoft takes to protect its resources, and it's one that we recommend you take as well. But when it comes to the cloud, security doesn't just fall on one party. It's actually a shared responsibility. And this graphic here, this should look familiar, especially if you've taken AZ900. This is what we called a shared responsibility model. And what it's showing is the different level of responsibility depending on if you are leveraging services like IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, or if you're managing your own on-premises data center. So let's start over here on actually the left side of your chart. So with your on-premises data center, or you might hear this called the private cloud, you are responsible for absolutely everything. I mean, starting with the physical infrastructure, you have to do the racking and stacking, but you're also responsible for your operating systems and your applications. And you know what? You also have to manage your users and really, ultimately, your data. However, you'll notice as we venture into the cloud, the responsibility is now going to be shared between your cloud provider and you. And in this case, we're talking about Microsoft Azure. So at the IaaS level, or infrastructure as a service, you are relying on Microsoft to take care of the physical infrastructure, but we have the responsibility for securing it. And you'll notice because you're responsible for everything other than the physical infrastructure, you can change and move that responsibility level as you go into deeper areas of the cloud. So with platform as a service, you are no longer worried about the underlying operating system. Microsoft is going to secure the operating system, and there's some other support like controls over the network and the applications, but you're going to need to do your part, which means that you're building in security to your applications and you're managing who and what has access to your data. But even at the SaaS level, or what we call software as a service, this is really, you're leveraging or using a provider's software, but you still have responsibility when it comes to security. And what I want you to take away from this is that for your exam, the level of responsibility when it comes to security is going to vary depending on what cloud service you're using or if it's on-prem. But it's important to remember, no matter what, you will always be responsible for your data, your endpoints, your accounts, and your access management. Now, there's actually one more model that I want to share with you before we get into the different threats and some of the tools that you have to protect yourself. And this model is the CIA. Now, I'm not talking about the CIA like Men in Black who are chasing down aliens, but instead, this model is used to think about trade-offs when it comes to securing your data, confidentiality, integrity, and availability model. And the way I want you to look at this is when you are securing your organization, you can only choose 2 of 3. So you, as an organization, need to determine what's important. So when we talk about what confidentiality means, this is where you are keeping your data, your encryption keys, your passwords, or really any type of sensitive data a secret. This is usually the most visible part of security. And let's say that this is extremely important to your organization. So now what you have to do is you have to determine if you want to focus on availability, meaning that it's readily available to those who need it, and, they can decrypt it, or maybe you need to give up some of those integrity controls in order to have it. Because if you wanted to increase integrity, you're lowering the availability. Again, it's not all or nothing. But this model is designed for you to consider what are the potential trade-offs when it comes to securing your data and ultimately securing your organization. Now, so far, we've looked at some different concepts or models that can help you secure your data. But what are you protecting yourself from? You're protecting yourself from different types of threats. Now, some of these threats can be trying to steal your data, or they might be getting you to pay up some money to unlock your information. It's important, again, not just for your exam, but for your organization to understand the different types of threats and where they can come from. So the first one that we have here on the slide is called a data breach. And you might have heard of organizations who have suffered some sort of data breach, or maybe even you've been a victim of one yourself. A data breach is where some sort of data is stolen. The way attackers get this data can come from maybe a phishing email, or, it can even be like a scammy email from your tech department asking for your password. The next type of attack is a dictionary attack. This is where an attacker is trying to steal an identity by trying a huge amounts of passwords. Essentially, what's happening is the attacker will get like a username And then they have a list of common passwords. And basically, they try each password automatically until one works and the attacker's in. And here's actually a really scary thing. The most common password is password 123. And guess what's on the list of a dictionary attack? Yeah, you guessed it. Password 123. We'll talk about some of the tools next session to help ensure that your organization is requiring something more secure than that. But next, what we have on the list is what we call ransomware. And this is a type of code that makes its way into your applications or your devices, and it's going to lock you out. And then what the attacker does is that they demand money, or maybe put a ransom on file. That way you have to pay them to unlock it. I mean, I saw this article that said that companies have paid hackers have actually grown by 300% over the last year. And since we're working more remotely and maybe some of our security protections have been more lax, this gave, their hackers the perfect opportunity to attack your sensitive data. Now, the last one that we have on our list is what we call disruptive attacks. You might hear it called a distributed denial of service or a DDoS attack. But what happens here is, let's say, for example, I have a public-facing website. The DDoS attack is going to send so much traffic into my site, and what they're trying to do is overwhelm or take down my service. And this is harmful because it can prevent legitimate traffic from accessing my services. Now, these are just some of the different types of attacks. I mean, these are 4, but there are so many out there. Like we have Trojans or exploit kits. And new threats are constantly coming out. And you and your organization need to stay vigilant when it comes to defending yourself. And one of the ways that you can protect yourself against threats is by encrypting your data. And when you encrypt your data, you're going through a process where your data isn't readable or usable by anyone who isn't authorized to use it. And the way this works is that you actually scramble the data in some sort of way, maybe it's with a key or without, so that way it can only be read if you have the correct key to unscramble it. Now you have 2 different types of encryption, symmetric and asymmetric. These 2 types of encryption determine how that data is scrambled and then how you're unscrambling it. Symmetric encryption is where you're using the same key both to encrypt the data and decrypt the data. But with asymmetric encryption, you're going to have 2 different keys. You have a public key and a private key. Both of these data can actually encrypt the data, but only the private key can be used to decrypt, or what we call unscrambling that data. Now, you might have heard of phrases in the past like encryption in transit or encryption at rest. And what this means is this is how the data is protected when it's stored, or how it's encrypted when it's moving. Encryption at rest means that when your data is stored, let's say it's on a server or in a database, it's all scrambled up, and you have to have that key to unscramble it. So that way, let's say if your server was attacked, your data would be unusable without that key. Now, encryption at rest means that as your data is moving from one place to another, like let's say if you're pulling it from over your network from maybe like the public internet, it's encrypted to limit, the potential risk of outside exposure. Now, there's another form of protection called hashing. Now, a lot of folks get hashing and encryption confused. Hashing doesn't use a key. Instead, what we have is an algorithm to take that original data and it's converting it into a unique fixed value. So what happens is you're entering in the same data using that same hashing algorithm, and you're using that as an identifier. And that's ultimately what's going to be produced. So instead of encryption, where you have a key that converts it back to its original form, hashing keeps the unique identifier. And so many organizations use hashing to store their passwords. This is actually a lot more secure to store passwords than storing them in plain text. Now, that doesn't mean attackers don't know about hashing. So that's where we've actually created what we call salted passwords. And what this means is that there's a random value in front of the hash value, so it's even more unique and more secure. Now, if your brain is spinning with all this extra information and you're wondering how you're supposed to implement all these different recommendations, and you still have to manage costs, well, never fear. Let me introduce you to one of my favorite tools, the Cloud Adoption Framework. What this is, it's a collection of documents with guidances and best practices that have been developed over time, and we have it with our largest customers, and we've developed it with subject matter experts. So if you're worried about securing your environment in the cloud, I would make sure that you're leveraging this free tool. It's going to help you create a strategy when migrating to the cloud, and it can help you build out an actionable plan with your desired outcomes. And when you are preparing, it's going to provide checklists and really make sure you're ready for that change. And then once you migrate, or what we call adopting the cloud, it can help you move over your existing workloads seamlessly. And it's going to help you improve your existing solutions. But here's what's neat. It doesn't just stop there. Once you're in the cloud, it can help with governance and really managing your workloads. And even if you aren't actively going through a migration right now, the Cloud Adoption Framework can help you plan and really implement various changes and improvements. All right, so we've covered some of the different security concepts. And I promise we are going to dig a little bit deeper into some of those areas throughout the next 2 sessions. But what I want to take a moment and discuss is some of the different identity concepts before we really move on. And here's something that you may not realize. Every single person in your organization, well, they have an identity, but it doesn't stop there. Every single device that has access to your resources also has an identity. And an identity is really just a user or device and how they're being recognized on your corporate network. And guess what? If someone or something has access to your data and resources, they're at risk for an attack. So this is why an identity is an incredibly important area when it comes to security. Now, we just learned what a dictionary attack is. And as a reminder, this is an identity-focused type of an attack that, and quite frankly, it's not the only one. There are several out there, and you need to be aware and protect yourself against them. Because remember, password 123 is the most common password in the world. And a password-based attack is where an attacker is going to take a list of, those super common passwords, those weak passwords, and basically what they're trying to do is match them to a list of known usernames. And phishing is going to be another common type of identity attack. And while this is phishing with a PH, it works somewhat similar to the way that we think of phishing. An attacker is actually going to dangle bait in front of your users, who in this case are the target or fish. And this bait can be an email that maybe it looks like it comes from your CEO or your boss asking for some information. Or maybe it's having you click on a link where they're entering in their username and password. Now, sometimes these phishing emails are easy to spot. They're really obvious. They have bad spelling, bad images. But here's the thing. Attackers are getting better and better. And so sometimes they can be difficult to identify. My best piece of advice for you is, when in doubt, don't click the link. Now, spear phishing is a more specific form of phishing. In this case, the attacker is going to have some sort of information, like a database or maybe an employee org chart. So the email is going to look like it came from your boss or maybe someone else you work with. I actually had one of these happen to me. I got an email and it looked like it came from my boss, and it had the right signature, the right phone number, everything. And in the email, it said that she was with a customer and couldn't remember her password for an application, and so she was asking for mine. Now, I thought this was kind of fishy, no pun intended, but I gave her a call just to be safe, and she had no idea what I was talking about. So definitely, you're going to need to be careful when it comes to sharing information over email. And since there are so many different types of attacks focused on identities out there, it's important that you're doing everything to protect them. Remember our defense in depth chart? Well, it's our second layer. So we want to make sure we have a good line of defense. But here's the thing. I would argue it's turning into the first line of defense since we have so many remote workers out in the world, and you may not be able to use the physical security as your first line of defense for all of your data. So how do you go about protecting your identity? Well, I don't want you to think of it as tied to a single user or a single device. Instead, I want you to think of it as something that encompasses your entire organization. And we've come up with 4 primary pillars when it comes to protecting your organization identities. First is your administration over your identities. You need to understand when and why identities are being created. But more importantly, you need to know how they're being managed. But I would actually say authentication and authorization are probably the 2 biggest pillars when it comes to identity. So first, let's talk about the difference between the 2. Authentication is where I'm verifying I am who I say I am. This may look like I'm putting in my username and password, and we are going to talk about multi-authentication later on. But just remember, authentication is where I am verifying and proving my identity. Now, authorization is about what level of access I have and what I can do with it. So think about it this way. When I travel somewhere, via plane, I need to go to the airport. And once I'm all checked in and I'm ready to head to my gate, what's the first thing I need to do? I need to go through security. And when I do, they're going to ask me for 2 things, my boarding pass and my ID. And what they're doing is they're verifying that I am, in fact, Chelsea Lee, and my ID matches my boarding pass. They are authorizing me to go through security to the gates. Now, once I'm through, I just can't go anywhere I want in the airport and hop on any plane. No, I'm only authorized to go to certain points of the airport, like a waiting area or the restaurants, and I can't run out the door where the tarmac is without getting tackled by security. And what's more, I can only board a certain airplane at a certain time at a certain gate. And it has a certain destination. And even on the plane, guess what? I have a certain seat. I'm not authorized to hop on any plane and sit in first class. I'm only authorized for what my boarding pass says. So authentication is I am who I say I am, and authorization is what can I do? I would definitely make sure for your exam you know the difference. But this is something that I think is going to be helpful, knowing the differences for the rest of your studies. Now, the last pillar is, and it's really not the least pillar, but it's important, is auditing. Because it's important to understand who is, what they are doing, when, where, and why. And we're going to discuss all sorts of different tools, so that way you can track your users and what they're doing, and even help automate some of those different governance processes. But I actually want to take a moment and dig in a little bit deeper when it comes to the role of authentication and the change that we call modern authentication. But in order to do that, we have to go back in time to the good old client-server model days. In the past, you would have a client and a server. And usually what would happen is you have a user who's using the client and would do something like they would have a username and password. I mean, it's pretty similar to that, what we have today. But we had this for each server. And this could be a pain in the butt because think about it. If there were so many servers, a user would have to give their username and password each and every time. And, you would have to remember all of those usernames and passwords. And here's what would happen, is you would end up with multiple names and passwords all across the different servers. So with modern authentication, we introduce a new player in the setup. This is a thing called an identity provider. And what we're trying to do, or what we're trying to change, is that we're no longer going to send a name and a password to the server. Instead, the client is going to go to get a thing, what we call a security token from an identity provider. And the way that it does this is by presenting a name and a password to the identity provider. It may be a smart card, or it might be an authenticator app on the phone. It doesn't really matter. But there's a contract between the client and the identity provider. And we can get this thing called a security token from that identity provider. And then the client is presenting that security token to the server. The server is then able to take that token and validate that it's legitimate security token because the server has that trust relationship with the identity provider. And that trust relationship say that this server can either send a token to an identity provider or to get it validated, or really the knowledge of that identities provider sign-in key is enough to check the cryptographic signature on the token. Now you might be asking yourself, what is a token? It's simple. A token is just a signed document, a cryptographically signed document, and it contains things about the person using the client that are called claims. And a claim is simply information about that identity that's calling the server. And it doesn't actually have to be a person. It could be a device. It could be a software process. I mean, any of these things are an identity that are acting at the server level. So claims are just an attribute value pairs that are information about the identity that's using the servers. Later on today, we're going to be looking at Azure Active Directory, which is an example of a cloud-based identity provider. Now, another benefit of modern authentication is that you can create one credential that can be used for a number of applications and resources. And this is what we call single sign-on. Now, when you set up single sign-on between multiple identity providers, it's called a federation. So let's look at the graphic that we have here on the screen. We have a website that uses the authentication services of IDPA, but the user is authenticating with IDPB. Now, even though they are two different services, there is an established trust relationship between IDPA and IDPB. So the credentials that the user logged on with IDPB are going to be passed through their website, and now they have access. What's really nice about this is that your users don't have to remember all sorts of different passwords. And really, you've probably used a federation service before. I mean, have you ever logged into a website or maybe created an account using social media? Like, what about LinkedIn? Well, in this case, LinkedIn is the identity provider, and there is a trust relationship between the website and LinkedIn. Now, one thing I do want to make note of is that there is a trust, just because there is a trust relationship doesn't mean that it's bidirectional, and you have to set it up that way. So if I use my LinkedIn to access a website, unless that trusted relationship is set up as a bidirectional trust, that website can't log into my LinkedIn. The last section of this module I want to discuss is the concept of Active Directory. Now, we're going to be going into a lot more detail around Azure Active Directory in the next module, but I want to make sure that you understand what a directory is and how it's used. A directory is a hierarchical structure that stores information about objects on your network. All of that data is available to users and services and applications that are on your network. And if you've been around Microsoft for a while, you may have heard something called Active Directory. This is a directory service that came around Windows 2000, and it was designed for your on-prem networks. This was a great tool for both authentication and authorization in your on-prem environment. But guess what? Technology changed, and we moved to more mobile devices, and those are continuously being added to our networks. And Active Directory just didn't have the native support for modern authentication methods. And that's where Azure Active Directory came into the picture. You might hear me call it AAD, but Azure Active Directory was developed as the next generation of directory services for both your on-prem and your cloud environments. And like I said, we're going to cover all things Azure Active Directory in Module 3, but if you wanted to see a detailed comparison of Active Directory compared to Azure Active Directory, we have this phenomenal comparison guide in Microsoft Docs. You can find that at aka.ms/AD versus AAD. That's AD vs AAD. So let's go ahead and just wrap up this Module 1. And don't you worry, the fun is just getting started. This module is really just an introduction into some of the different security and identity concepts. We looked at a few different identity models or security models when it comes to Zero Trust or CIA, but we also looked at the different threats that you need to be aware of and really to protect yourself against. We've just scratched the surface when it comes to some of the tools like Azure Active Directory, but that's coming in Module 2. And as a reminder for everyone, all of the material in my slides, plus extra videos and knowledge checks, are available for free in the learning path at aka.ms/scfunpath. But you know what? I'm thinking it's time for a quick break. So how about this? We're going to take a 10-minute break, give yourself a chance to digest some of these concepts, grab a drink of water, and when we come back, we're going to dive headfirst into Module 2, which is all about identity and access management solutions that are available inside of Microsoft 365. So I'll see you back here in 10. Welcome back from break. I hope you're ready for Module 2, because this is probably going to be our heaviest module of the day. This module focuses on everything Azure Active Directory. Now, I do want to point out a few things before we get started. One, this is a fundamentals course. What that means is that our goal is to identify and describe different components of Azure Active Directory. I'm going to take you on a tour of the Azure Active Directory admin portal, but you're not going to have any labs on your SC900 exam. However, if you are interested in learning more about Azure Active Directory, I'd recommend that you check out the Azure Administrator course and the Azure Developer course. And that does have a little bit more of a hands-on component to the exam, and it's going to go much deeper than we will today. The second thing is even though Azure Directory and Active Directory are two different products, the names sometimes are going to be used interchangeably. I'm going to try my best to make sure I always call it Azure Active Directory or AAD, but if I slip up and call it Active Directory, and for this module, I'm only talking about Azure Active Directory. And one last thing I want to call out, as a reminder, all of this information for this module and all the other sections of the course are available on Microsoft Learn, and you can find that at aka.ms/scfunpath. With that being said, are you ready for Azure Active Directory? I know I am. So let's go ahead and dive right in. This module, like I said, is going to be the biggest one of the day. And we're going to explore the different capabilities of Azure Active Directory and some of the tools that are available to help you manage your environment. Again, I'm going to show you some of the tools in the portal, but there's not any labs on your exam. So let's go ahead and take a look at our first section, which is looking at the different services and identity types inside of Azure Active Directory. Now, in Module 1, we learned what a directory is. Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's cloud-based identity and access management service, and it's designed to support your modern authentication with both your on-prem and your cloud-based environments. And it's great because it can help you manage all your different identities by giving your admins a single system for all of your applications. And I don't want you to worry if you have an existing on-prem Active Directory, because Azure Active Directory can actually be synced with existing on-prem Active Directories. Or you can even choose to use Azure Active Directory as a standalone service. Because think about it. As more and more organizations move to the cloud or allow users to bring their own devices like phones or tablets or laptops, you need to make sure your corporate data is secure. So Azure Active Directory lets your admins control all of your corporate applications and resources based off of the needs of the business. We're going to look at some of those different features shortly, but I do want to mention that if you have M365, Dynamics, or really any of the Office 365 services, guess what? You're actually already using Azure Active Directory. Now, Azure Active Directory has 4 different types of identities. You have your users, your service principals, your managed identities, and your devices. So let's start with your users, because I think that's what most of you are going to first think when you think of Azure Active Directory. A user is just an identity, and that's something that's managed by Azure Active Directory. And it can be an employee or even guests, but what it does is it allows you to control access for each user, or you can group them together, and that way you can apply permissions to that entire group instead of having to go one by one. I'm going to show you how to add a user to your Azure Active Directory in a minute, but I want to talk next about a service principal. This is going to be a secured identity that's used by your applications. A managed identity is an identity that's automatically created by Azure Active Directory and are used for managing more your credentials for your cloud applications. It's a great tool because you can have your Azure services authenticate to another service like Azure Key Vault. Now, there's going to be 2 types of managed identities. You have your system assigned and your user assigned. Last, what we have is your devices. It's exactly what it sounds like. This is your laptops, your phones, it's even your printers. And we're going to talk about in our next session about Intune, and this is how we're going to discuss how to secure your organization's devices, but inside of Azure Active Directory, and you can manage it through the devices you own, as well as those who are brought by your employees. But how about this? Why don't we go ahead and log into the Azure Active Directory portal, and I'll show you how to add and manage your users. So we are logged in now to the Azure portal, and the way that you get here is by going to portal.azure.com, and we're signing in with our admin credentials. Now, the account that I'm using today doesn't have an associated subscription with it, so it might look a little different from yours. But since I'm an admin, I can actually manage my Azure Active Directory through the portal. So I'm going to select View underneath Manage Azure Active Directory. And here we're inside of my tenants directory. And this is where I can manage all my different users, my groups, and so much more. And over here on the left-hand side, these are some of the different management tools or different options that we have. Now, I have my overview page right here, and I'm going to create a new user. So I am going to scroll all the way down. Under Quick Actions, I'm going to select Add User. And here is where I can create my new user. Now, this could be an employee who just joined, maybe it's a contractor, maybe it's a guest I'm giving access to. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to enter a name for this employee or a username. And this is where you can follow your organization's naming standards, but I'm going to just do something simple. So we're going to just do J Doe. And so in this case, I have my name. I'm going to do Jane Doe as my name, first name, Jane, last name, Doe. So I have my username, and you can see the username is tied to my domain. As far as the password goes, I'm going to keep the auto-generated password, but you can also create your own if you wanted to do. Now, what we can do is we can scroll down, and we're going to add Jane to some groups. So I'm going to select the groups here, and I'm going to search my tenant, and let's add her to the security tenant. So I'm going to add her to the SSPR security group. And we'll select her, add her to that selected group. And now I can add her a role for her. I can give her a different role. There's a ton. If I select here, you can see we have a ton of pre-built roles in there. I'm going to just keep her as a user for now, but you can see we have pre-built ones. And if you wanted to, you can even create your own custom roles. I'm going to leave her as a regular user right now. And now you can see this is where if I wanted to have some usage, so if I wanted to block any particular sign-in locations, as well as the job information. Now, I'm not going to add any information for Jane here, but let's go ahead and create her as a user. All right, and you can see I've gotten a notification that Jane has been actually created. And so if I go over here to my left-hand side on the overview page, I can manage my users. So if I select users, we can see I have 35 users in here. And if we search, I'm going to actually just search for Jane. Here we go. We have Jane, who I created earlier. So there we go. We have just created a user inside of Azure Active Directory. Now remember, I can choose to add someone to my Azure Active Directory who's outside of my organization. And here's the thing, that's becoming more and more normal in today's world as you work with different consultants and different partners or even customers. And inside of Azure Active Directory, there are two types of identities. You have business to business, meaning that you have a business where you're sharing your application with external users. And here, you still have total control over your data, and you really manage those users the same way you would your own employees. Now, the other type of external identity is what we call business to customer, or B2C. This allows your customers to log into your application using their preferred identity. This can be a social media account or even some of our local accounts as well. Now, remember how I said Azure Active Directory and your on-premises Active Directory can work together? Well, this is what we call a hybrid identity model. And this is the case where your users are accessing both your on-premises and your cloud applications. So that way, when you make an update in your on-premises Active Directory, updates to all of your users, your accounts, your groups, your contacts are all going to be synchronized with your Azure Active Directory. This is all happening on the back end. So there's really little to no effort on your part. And we do this through a tool called Azure AD Connect. And when it comes to authentication, you can have it done by Azure Active Directory, or you can even use another identity provider. Either way, I want to make sure that you don't think you're limited to only Azure Active Directory or your on-prem Active Directory. You can actually combine the two. So now that we've looked at the different user types and actually how to create them in Azure Active Directory, I want to dig into our next lesson, which is focused entirely on the authentication tools inside of Azure. And you know what, let's face it, no one likes passwords. I can't tell you the feeling of dread when I see that notice that pops up that says, your password has expired. And doesn't it feel like it limits you from using your last dozen passwords? I mean, how the heck am I supposed to remember different passwords for all my different accounts? And you know who loves passwords? Hackers. You know why? Because we're so bad at writing passwords. We want to make them easy to remember. And unfortunately, the easier they are to remember, the easier it is for hackers to get into them. So what are we supposed to do then? If we know the most common password is password 123, how are we supposed to protect our organization and from our users falling prey to hackers? Well, that's where multi-factor authentication, or MFA, comes in. MFA requires your users to provide more than one form of authentication to log in. And usually these fall under 3 different categories: something you know, something you have, or something you are. With something you know, that's your username and password. It's a piece of information only you should know, and the keyword being should. But since we know that a password can get hacked, we add an additional level of security with something you have or something you are. An example of something you have can be like a phone with an authenticator app maybe you have installed, or you can even have a little key that automatically regenerates numbers that you have to enter in every 30 seconds. Something you are is biometric information, think of facial recognition on your phone or fingerprints. And when you add MFA to your business, you actually cut your risk of attack by 99.9%. And inside of Azure Active Directory, there's a few different ways where you can add multi-factor authentication. We already know that passwords aren't the greatest form of security. And while yes, you want a strong password, it can cause issues if a user forgets it because it was too complicated for them to remember. And that's why we recommend password plus an additional form of verification. I mean, have you ever tried logging into a site that texted you a code and you needed to enter it in before you logged in? Well, that's a form of multi-factor authentication. And that's where you're using something you know, your password, and something you have, your phone. Here at Microsoft, I actually use an app called Microsoft Authenticator. This is an application on my phone that will ask me to approve a login attempt. And what's cool, it actually uses some of the biometric tools like a face or fingerprint scan to verify my identity. Authenticator is going to then issue what we called an OAuth, or an open authentication code, as a one-time password or a login approval. This is another layer of security because that OAuth token usually expires every 30 seconds or so. But what happens if you don't want to mess with passwords at all? Well, you have a couple options there as well. You can use something called Fido, not your dog Fido, but a fast identity online tool that allows you to log in without a password. Usually what you'll have is some sort of physical key like a USB or an NFC that allows you to log in so you don't ever have to remember a password. But there's actually another tool called Windows Hello for Business, and that's actually how I log into my computer. Windows Hello lets you log into your Azure Active Directory without a password by using your PIN or a face scan. Now that PIN and face scan is only good for that one device. So even if someone got my PIN or somehow my face, they're still going to need my device. But let's say, for example, you still do want to use passwords and you want to implement a certain duration that the password can be used for, or the length and the number of characters. And if you don't already know this, I'm going to tell you, your users are going to forget their passwords. And you know what, side note, you know what bugs me more than anything? When I forget my password and I go to reset it and I enter a new one and it tells me I can't use my most recent password. Sorry, anywho. When your users do forget their password, because it's going to happen, you're going to want to give them a tool to reset it themselves. That way they're not calling into your help desk. One, this is going to save your IT team so much headache of resetting passwords. But it's also going to add a layer of security since only the user will be able to reset or see their password. And Azure Active Directory can help your users change or reset their password by using their phones or their emails. And the best part is that your admins have full control over the self-service tool and can say who and when users request a reset. So let's log back into the admin portal and I'll show you how easy it is to configure. Okay, so we're back in the portal. Again, following the same steps from before, we're going to select View to open our admin center for Azure Active Directory. Now, in order to add self-service password reset to our tenant, we're actually going to scroll down over here on the left-hand side underneath Manage, and we're looking for Password Reset. We have that right here next to the key. Now, from the main page of the password reset, I can choose to enable self-service for none, selected, or all. I'm actually going to select all and then save. Okay, so now what I've done is I've given the users the option to reset their passwords on their own. And I can actually add additional authentication steps before they reset it. So I'm going to come down here under Manage and select Authentication Methods. And then from here, I can determine how many pieces of information I want my users to provide before they can reset their password. So I'm going to select one, which is already there, and then I'm going to require them to either authenticate themselves through email or a mobile phone, which is a text message. All right. I can also require users to authenticate themselves when they sign on for the first time. So this is where I can come down to registration. And so I can require the user to register when signing in. And then I can also set them to re-authenticate themselves every 180 days, whichever I'd like. And then finally, what I can do is I can set up notifications. So when a user resets their password, maybe I want an email to get sent to that user, or I can actually have an alert sent to the admins as well. Now, going back to our slides, we know it's possible for your users to reset their own passwords pretty easy, but Azure Active Directory can also make sure that your users are creating strong passwords, and we do this by setting up a banned password list. And you can totally customize it. And that way you can ban those weak passwords based off of your organization standards. But we also include recommendations based off of Microsoft's security team, who is up to date on the latest hacking patterns. And remember how Azure Active Directory can be used in combination with your on-prem Active Directory? Well, you can actually use Azure Active Directory to protect passwords in your on-premises Active Directory as well. All right, lesson 3. We've discussed authentication, which is all about proving you are who you say you are. But now let's talk about access controls inside of Active Directory. And if you've taken AZ900 or really any of our other Azure courses, you know there are massive benefits for organizations to move to the cloud. You get increased availability, scalability, and all around more agility when it comes to running your business. And on top of that, more employees are working remotely. So your security team needs to make sure that your legacy applications and your cloud applications are secure, and you have to make sure all of this is available to the right folks. And you know what? This all requires granular controls. Enter Conditional Access inside of Azure Active Directory. Now, this is actually a premium feature, but what it does is it allows you to set policies that are structured like if-then statements that you can determine access to your applications. A really easy example of this is if I'm a user working for Contoso accessing an application, let's say like Office 365, then I must perform multi-factor authentication. But it doesn't just stop with multi-factor authentication. Conditional access combines signals like users, groups, or like your network locations, the application, the devices, or even the risk. And it combines this with making decisions like blocking access or requiring a compliant device. It may even force a password change or require terms of use before you can actually get in and use it. So I'm going to actually log back into the portal, and I'm going to show you how to set up conditional access. So we're back in our admin portal for Azure Active Directory. And over here on the left-hand side, I'm going to scroll down underneath our tools, and we're looking for security. I have security right here at the bottom, and this is going to provide security for all of my Azure Active Directory. We're not going to be able to talk about all of this today in this session, but I do want to point out the conditional access. So when I select conditional access, this is where I can actually set up those if-then statements. So let's say, for example, I have a group of retail employees who are working remote. And so when they are accessing some of my cloud applications, I want to enable multi-factor authentication. So I'm going to select new policy, and we'll name this. I'm going to just say retail MFA. And now I need to select either the users or the group that I want this policy to affect. So I'm going to select users and groups. And I'm going to look specifically for my retail group. So we're going to come over here and select retail. Select and add them. It's important that you actually select them, otherwise it won't go through. And now I want to have what either application or action that they take. So in this case, I want it when they are accessing a certain app. And let's use Office 365. And we'll select that. So anytime anyone from my retail group accesses Office 365, I now want to control what happens, and I want to grant access. So when I grant access, it's under Access Controls, and I am going to grant access after they go through multi-factor authentication. Now you can see here I can choose to block access, or I can require different steps. But you can see here I'm just requiring that multi-factor authentication. So we'll hit Select. And now that control has been selected. So what we've done through is we've said our retail employees, when they access Office 365, grant access only after they went through multi-factor authentication. I need to enable this policy. And once I do that, I select Create, and that policy will create. Now, anybody who is a retail employee, once they try to log into Office 365, they'll be prompted for their username and password, but then some type of multi-factor authentication. That could be something that they have, like a key or an authenticator app, or maybe something they are, that biometric scanning. So there we go, that's conditional access. Why don't we go ahead and jump back to our slides. I want to touch very briefly on managing what your users can do using Azure Active Directory. There are both built-in and custom roles that your admins can manage to determine what your users can and cannot do inside of Azure. Now remember, the key thing here is when it comes to giving access is that you want to provide the least level of access that a user needs to do their job. And it's always easy to add additional access if you need to, but it can actually be a bit of a mess if you grant too much and then you need to take it back. So when we talk about role-based access control, or RBAC, inside of Azure Active Directory, you can still use built-in roles like Global Administrator or Billing Administrator. And these can be customized if you need them to. But the nice thing is that they all come pre-configured, and there's over 100 different roles that you can select from. However, let's say you need to create your own, you do have the flexibility in order to do so. And you will need to create the role definition first. And the role definition is just a list of permissions. But then what you're doing is you are adding the scope to determine what resources those permissions are going to apply to. Again, it doesn't matter if you use pre-built or custom roles, just be aware of the level of access that you're granting your users. Okay, so here we are. We are on to our final lesson of Module 2. We've looked at what Azure Active Directory can do and the different available tools in it. But for the last section, I want to explore how your admins can control and protect your organization through Azure Active Directory. Now, when organizations are looking at their identity solutions and security, there's always 4 questions that should be top of mind. 1, which user should have access to which resources? 2, What are those users doing with that access? 3, are their controls set in place effective for managing that access? And 4, can the audit team verify that these controls are working? And inside of Azure Active Directory, there are tools that are built in to help answer these questions, and with 3 key areas of governance. We have the identity lifecycle, the access cycle, and ensuring that your admin controls are secure. So you might be asking yourself, what is an identity lifecycle? Well, it actually starts at the time of hire, and this is where that user is going to be assigned an identity. And from there, they might change jobs or roles within the same organization. And that lifecycle comes to an end when that user ultimately leaves your organization. Now, in most organizations, that lifecycle is going to be tied to what we call the HRIS, or the Human Resources Information System. And it depends on your Azure Active Directory tier, but it is possible to integrate your Azure Active Directory with your cloud HR system, and that way your directory is always up to date. Now, for the access lifecycle, this is only going to apply while the user is employed at the organization. So let's say, for example, I have an employee who joins the organization and they start off as a payroll admin. They're only going to have access to the applications and the data that they need. But what happens when they get promoted? Maybe they go from an admin to a specialist. Their access level will need to change. And one of the ways to streamline the access lifecycle process inside of Azure Active Directory is to use what we call dynamic groups. These groups can be modified by your admins to determine membership roles. And so that way, when there is a change, like let's say a user can be added or removed from a group, it can be handled automatically. This way, you're not stuck trying to manage everyone's access individually. So the next area of Azure Active Directory governance, this is going to be entitlement management. Now, entitlement management allows your organization to manage access to your groups, your applications, your SharePoint, online sites, whether it's for internal or external users. And the key thing here is that you're managing all the controls, like the different workflows and all the different policies at scale. And the way that entitlement management works is it's creating and managing what we call access packages. And these are collections of different resources that are grouped together and they're requested all together. So let's say, for example, I have a new employee and they're joining our team for the first time to help out with a project. What do they need? Are they going to access some of our applications, maybe our SharePoint site, Teams channel, and a whole bunch of other things. But here's the thing. When that new person joins the team, do they know what they need? I mean, how many of you have joined a new company and it kind of just felt like an ongoing process? You kept finding out all the different things that you had to request access to. I know I have. And here's the thing. You can't just snap your fingers and instantly get access to it. You need to request access, and that can take who knows how long, depending on the workload for the manager or the IT team. And this is a massive headache, and honestly, it can hurt productivity on the team. Plus, it just makes your organization look unprepared. And that's where entitlement management comes to the rescue. You can create these access packages for all the resources that are needed for a particular project or, let's say, a role. And that way, when a person joins your team or a project, they can go to one place and request access and get everything they need without having to know the individual resources. But I don't want you to worry. Entitlement management makes it so you have to have the right scope and user approval before the resources are just given out. And on top of that, you can even set expiration policies, so that way you can limit your risk by making sure that the right people have the right access for just the right amount of time. Now, I have just a couple more things I want to talk about in this module, and one of them being privileged identity management. We already know companies are at an increased risk of compromise today. And the risk is even bigger when it comes to an account with a high level of access. Because think about it. An admin account has access to potentially sensitive data and resources that you do not want falling in the wrong hands. Well, PIM, or Privileged Identity Management, can help reduce that risk by providing just-in-time access and just enough access for these accounts. So what does just-in-time access mean? Well, PIM has an activation period tied to the role setting for a role. The IT admin can pick an activation period between 0 and, let's say, 24 hours. What this means is that user who wants to come in and activate their role will only get that privilege for this pre-configured amount of time before that access is revoked. And they will have to go through that activation process again if they want to continue to use that role. Then PIM also supports the concept of what we call time-bound assignments. When you make a role outside of PIM, that role is permanent, and it's going to last forever unless someone comes in and removes that assignment. But what PIM does is allows you to set an end time for a role assignment itself. And so where this is particularly useful is, let's say you have a guest scenario. If you have like someone in your organization who's coming in to work for 2 months, you can actually set the expiration time of that role assignment for 2 months in the future. And once that time's up, that user is automatically removed from the role, whether or not you're deprovisioning them from your HR system. Now, we also have an approval process inside of PIM, and this supports when a user is activated into a particular role, you can actually designate one or more approvers who are going to have to approve that setting. So when a user requests a role activation, your approvers are going to receive an email, and they actually have to go inside of PIM to approve it. Until that role is approved, there won't be any type of activation. Once the approvers approve the role in PIM, then the role will be activated. And you can even set it for that limited time. The last couple areas inside of PIM is going to be the audit log. And it's keeping track of all of the events happening inside of PIM. And what is even better about PIM's audit log is that it's automatically included inside of your Azure Active Directory audit log, which gives you the ability to funnel all of these logs into log analytics. And we usually see customers using this to create some sort of customized alerts inside of their organizations, whether it's a specific account that's been activated or if you have someone making change to a role setting. And that actually brings me to our last slide of this module, woohoo, Azure Identity Protection. And I think after Module 1, we can all agree that there are a lot of threats out there, especially the threats that are targeted at getting access to your organization's identities. Did you know that Microsoft analyzes over 6.5 trillion signals a day to identify potential threats? Well, all of these signals are being fed to what we call Azure Identity Protection. It's taking all of those signals and it's categorizing them into 3 different tiers: low, medium, and high. So let's say you have a user signing in from a different location than normal, or if you know that credentials have been leaked. Azure Identity Protection can trigger different actions like MFA or to block their account until an admin can review it. Azure Identity Protection can also give you 3 different reports that are a really handy tool for your security team. You can pull a list of users who might put you at risk, any odd sign-in attempts, or just risks that were detected. And your security team can take these reports and determine if there's maybe a weak point in your security, or you can even investigate these alerts even more. And that actually takes us to the end of Module 2. We got to spend some quality time looking at the different tools and functions inside of Azure Active Directory. We've discussed some of the ways that Azure Active Directory can help protect your environment with MFA or Conditional Access. And then we wrapped up the module exploring some of the different governance tools. Now, I highly recommend that you and your admin team spend some time getting to know some of these different tools. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I want to make sure that everyone knows about the free learning path. You can find that at aka.ms/scfunpath. And in addition to all of the material I've covered, there's those helpful videos that really go into more depth on some of these topics. And of course, my favorite, the knowledge checks. Again, you can find all of this at aka.ms/scfunpath. So, how about this? Let's take one last break, a good 10-minute stretch break, give you a chance to step away from your computer, maybe grab a quick drink or a snack, and then we'll come back for our final module of the day. Sound good? Okay, and I'll see you back here in 10. welcome back from break. I hope you had a chance to step away from the computer and decompress for a little bit, because I know a full day of virtual training can definitely be a lot. And while we're almost done, I want to make sure you're good and ready for Module 3, because we are actually going to be splitting this one in two. Today, we're going to look at the different security solutions inside of Azure specifically. But in part 2, I'm actually going to pick up where we leave off and go through the different security solutions in M365. So the first half of Module 3, we're going to look at some of the different security capabilities inside of Azure, as well as some of the different management tools that are available. And then we're going to close out the day by looking at Azure Sentinel. And this is a really cool tool, which will give you a bird's eye view of your full security environment. And just a reminder, everything in this module is available for free at Microsoft Learn, and you can find that at aka.ms/scfunpath. So let's go ahead and get started with some of the different security options that are inside of Azure to help protect your network, your virtual machines, and most importantly, your data. And I want to start with your network first. But before I get too much into detail on network security, let's actually do a quick review on networking inside of Azure. So inside of Azure, we have something called a virtual network, or you might hear it as a VNet. This is pretty similar to the network you'd have on your on-premises environment. And I want you to think of a virtual network as a communication and isolation boundary that you connect to your different virtual machines that's allowing communication with other virtual machines, the internet, or even your on-prem environment. And since traffic is going back and forth between your different virtual machines, you're going to want to limit what type of traffic you let in and out of your virtual network. And that's where network security groups come in. A network security group, or an NSG, allows you to deny or let in traffic from your Azure resources that are on your virtual network. The way it does this is by evaluating 5 different areas. It looks at the source port, the destination, the port, and its protocol. So if you actually look at the graphic that we have here on the screen, the Azure Virtual Network has 2 subnets that are connected to the internet. And each subnet has a virtual machine. Subnet 1 has an NSG assigned to it that's filtering all inbound and outbound access to that first virtual machine because it needs a higher level of access. But if you actually look at VM2, which maybe let's say this is a public-facing machine, that one we don't have an NSG because it doesn't need to have that same level of access. And the way that NSGs are set up is that they have inbound and outbound security rules. And this is where you select which area that you want to evaluate and the priority of the rule. Azure is automatically going to create the NSG rules for you, and you can't remove them. However, you can override them with a higher priority rule. So why don't we go ahead and log into the Azure portal, and I'll show you how to set up a network security group for a virtual machine. As a reminder, to get there, you'll go to portal.azure.com. In the Azure portal, I'm going to show you how to create a network security group first. So when we go in, I have it right here on my Azure services, but remember, since it's an Azure resource, there's a bunch of different ways you can create it. You can go through the portal menu, you can run a script in Cloud Shell, you can search for it. I have it here on my recent resources, so I'm just going to select network security groups, select create, and it's real simple. All I need to do is I need to select my subscription, my resource group. We're going to use my SC900 resource group, and we'll name it. So I'll call this my NSG SC900. And we'll keep it in the East US region. We'll let it create. It'll go through validation and create. All right, so our resource is deployed. I'm going to select go to resource. And here we have my network security group. Ooh, but check this out. I already have some inbound and outbound rules, but I didn't create those, did I? No, because Azure is going to provide you with a base level security. So you can see here that we are denying all traffic except for traffic that's coming from an internal Azure VNet or like an Azure load balancer. And I'm also denying all outbound traffic as well. Now, I can't delete these rules. These are standard, but I can always override them. And the way that I override them is I need to add a rule with a higher level of priority. You can see, let's take this one for example. This has a priority level of 65,000. Essentially, to create a rule with a higher priority is I just need to label that rule any number less than 65,000. So the lower the number, the higher the priority. And so if you were to think about it, 1 would be the highest priority level. Now, because I am denying all inbound traffic, I can't RDP into this virtual machine. And I actually haven't even associated a virtual machine or a virtual network with this NSG. So let me show you how you do that. So if I go to Network Interfaces and I select Associate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop down on this list and I'm going to select the virtual machine that I had created already. Now, I want to just point out one thing about a virtual machine. I'm not going to show you how to create that in this session, but AZ900 is a really great overview. It's a great class where we show you an introduction to virtual machines, how to use them, and how to create one. But you can also always check out docs.microsoft.com, and there's a bunch of helpful step-by-step guides on there. So I'm going to select the virtual network for that VM, select OK. And now that virtual machine and that virtual network have been associated with this network security group. Now, I just want to show you because we are denying all inbound traffic. So if I was to actually come to my virtual machine, and I open up that virtual machine, and I try to connect, and so I'm going to try to connect through RDP. When I download that RDP file, it's going to let me log in. So I'm going to select Connect. Uh-oh, what's happening? Well, I can't remote desktop into this, and that's because we are denying all inbound traffic. So let me show you how I can fix this. So I'm actually going to come back to my network security group, and I'm going to add an inbound security rule. You can see that over here on the left-hand side underneath Settings, Inbound Security Rules. I'm going to select Add. Now my source, I'm going to keep as any port ranges. I'm going to leave as an asterisk to select all. Destination, what we're going to do is we're going to leave that as any, but the service, we're going to change this to RDP. And you can see here, I'm going to let the action of allow. So the deny all inbound, other than the load balancer and the virtual network, this is 65,500. So I just need basically any priority level that's lower than 65,000. So let's just call it 4,000. All right, and we're gonna say allow RDP as the name, and we'll add this. Perfect, now that security rule has been created. I'm gonna go ahead and refresh, and there we go. We can see I've now allowed that remote desktop protocol. So I'm gonna come back over to my virtual machine. Now, it might take a minute for this to go into effect, so I'm going to just do a quick restart just to make sure that that network security group takes effect. All right, and that virtual machine has been restarted. So now what we can do is we can actually select Connect. I'm going to do RDP. I'm going to download that RDP file again, and when I select it, I'm going to connect. It's now going to prompt me for my username because now I've allowed that RDP credentials. So I'm going to plug in my credentials. And then now it's going to actually launch that virtual machine. So you can see that network security group, we have now controlled the inbound traffic, and RDP being one of those. So I'll give it a second to log on so you can see our virtual machine. And here we are. We are inside of our virtual machine. So again, that is one of the ways that a network security group can be used. So next on our list of security tools inside of Azure is our DDoS protection. Remember in Module 1 where we learned about the distributed denial and the different service attacks, where the goal is to send so much traffic to your service that it gets overwhelmed and fails? Well, inside of Azure, you have a built-in service to help protect your organization from these malicious attacks. And the way it works is that Azure is monitoring the traffic that's coming into your network. And once it recognizes an attacker, it's going to automatically block their traffic. But it's actually going to leave your network open to legitimate traffic. So that way you're not facing any type of interruption service for your customers. And here's the nice thing about the built-in DDoS service, is since you're in the cloud, it can actually provide an elastic response. So you can scale your compute during an attack. That way you can still support the real traffic, but you're not going to pay for the resources that weren't for your actual customers' traffic. And I mentioned that the Azure has a built-in DDoS protection. This is what we considered the basic tier. But let's say, for example, you needed a more advanced tier, maybe you had some business critical workloads, you can actually select what we call the standard tier. Now, this one does have a little bit more of a cost associated with it. And unlike the basic tier, it's actually going to give you an extra mitigation and monitoring tools, and that's the reason for the elevated cost. Now, as we move on to Azure Firewall, I want to take a minute and I want to have you think back to Module 1. Remember where we discussed defense in depth? The Azure Firewall's goal is to protect your perimeter, and it's going to try to stop any sort of attacks before it can make it onto your network. And the Azure Firewall is a scalable solution that you can adjust to meet the need of your traffic. But on top of that, you have built-in high availability and the use of availability zones. Now, like your NSG, it uses IP addresses, the ports, and protocols for filtering. And, this is really cool, it has built-in threat intelligence detection that can automatically block known malicious IP addresses. And we're going to talk some about this later on in the monitoring tools, but Azure Firewall integrates seamlessly into Azure Monitor. So you're going to have access to all of the logs where you can dig into different traffic as you need. But now what I want you to do is I want to imagine, you've set up your firewalls, your NSGs, and you're feeling pretty good about your defense against external threats. But if you are using that remote desktop protocols and the SSH ports, guess what? You have just exposed yourself to different types of attacks. And that's where we have Azure Bastion. What this does is it's providing a secure RDP or SSH connection to all of your virtual machines from the Azure portal. And what this means is that when you connect to your virtual machine, it doesn't need any public IP address or any special type of software. And when you deploy Azure Bastion, it'll provide a secure connection to all the virtual machines on your virtual network. And if you're using Azure Bastion, you don't need to apply NSGs to the virtual network subnet. And one last thing. We've looked at how to protect your virtual machines, your networks, and your data using the NSGs, the firewalls, all that. But we need to look at how you're protecting your web applications as well. And that's where the web application firewall comes in. What this does is it's providing protection for your web applications from, the common attacks. And it's also protecting you against different threats. It's nice because you're not having to worry about patching an entire web application. Instead, you can just focus on one area that's needed, which really saves time for your team. And where the web application firewall can come in handy is protecting yourself against SQL injection and that cross-site scripting. And here's the thing, it's really hard to protect yourself against those type of attacks in the code of an application. So the web application firewall really comes in handy there. Now, I know we've already talked about or really discussed the way that encryption works, but I want to go into a little bit more detail on how encryption works inside of Azure. So let's look at the encryption with Azure Storage. What it's doing is it's protecting your data while it's at rest by automatically encrypting your data before it's stored in your Azure account. And this is for your blob storage, your file storage, or even your queue storage. And it can be used to manage your disks. Now, if you retrieve your data, it'll decrypt it for you as well. And with Azure Disk Encryption, it kind of does exactly the way it's named. It allows you to encrypt your virtual machine disks by using industry standard BitLocker to add volume encryption to the operating system and your data disks. And then last, what we have is we have the transparent data encryption, or you might also hear TDE. This is designed to help you protect your Azure SQL databases and your data warehouses by encrypting and decrypting the database in real time. And it includes all of your backups and your logs, but you don't have to make changes to your applications. Now, these different tools are all about scrambling up your data so it's not easily read without the appropriate key. But what about your organization secrets? Well, that's where we have Azure Key Vault. And this service in Azure is designed to give your organization a central place to store all of your application secrets. It's a vault. The Key Vault is giving you total control over who, over what, when, where, why your secrets are being accessed. So let's say I need to manage APIs or keys for encryption. The Key Vault, that's the perfect place to store it. You can even manage your public certificates in Azure Key Vault, and you can choose to protect that Key Vault with either software of FIPS 142 or validated HSMs. And so far, we've talked about ways to protect yourself against outside threats. But I actually want to show you some tools inside of the portal that can help you protect your data and resources internally. How many of you have ever been working on a project with someone else and a file gets accidentally deleted or edited even when you didn't want it to? Or even worse, have you ever accidentally deleted a file yourself? I have, and it's the worst feeling ever. But inside of Azure, we have this handy dandy little tool called the Azure Resource Manager Logs. And this is going to help prevent any type of accidental deletion or modification of your resources. Now we have two different lock types, read-only and cannot delete. And the names kind of pretty much explain what they do. Cannot delete lock? Well, you can modify the lock, but guess what? Can't delete it. And, depending on the role that you have set up, only certain users can remove that lock. But let's say you needed something a little bit more restrictive, and you wanted to make sure no one could delete it, but you also wanted to make sure you couldn't modify it whatsoever. A read-only lock is going to prevent any type of modification whatsoever, and it's also going to prevent you from deleting that resource. Now, both of these resource locks can either be applied at the resource level or the resource group level. But just know, if you apply a lock at a resource group level, it's automatically going to apply to all the resources below it. And, a lock is going to protect you from your resources being modified or deleted. But let's say you wanted to implement some type of governance that will allow you to enforce security or compliance standards across your entire organization. Well, that's why we have Azure Policies. And this is a really great security and governance tool. So let's say, for example, you wanted to limit the location on where users can deploy resources or only allow them to deploy a certain SKU number. You can actually create a policy that would prevent those users from doing so. And you have a great dashboard where you can see all of your compliance and all of your different resources across your organization. And with with policies, unlike resource locks, you can apply them at the management group level, the subscription level, the resource group level, and ultimately the resource level. So why don't we go ahead and log into the portal, and I'll show you how to add a policy. Again, as a reminder, to get here, you'll go to portal.azure.com, and I'm going to create a policy. And just like a network security group, a policy is also a resource. So you have your different ways that you can create it. But I have my policy tagged right up here, so I'm going to create a policy. And we can see here on my overview page, here are all of the different policies that I have applied to this particular subscription. We can see we have some default ones that are created by Azure for like the Azure Security Center. But what I want to do is, let's say, for example, for compliance reasons, I want to limit where users can deploy a particular resource. So let's say here, I want to assign a new policy. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to select Assignments, assign policy. And now this is the wizard that will walk you through assigning that policy. So the first thing is I need to select a scope. So what resources, what layer am I applying this policy to? So I am going to apply them to my demo subscription. And now let's say I wanted to apply it specifically to my SC900 resource group. So I'm going to select that. And in this case, I can add exclusions. So if I wanted to exclude particular resources, but I don't want that. I want to prevent any type of resource inside of my SC900 from, let's say, being deployed anywhere outside of, let's get crazy, Japan West, all right? So I'm going to go to my policy definition, and I can write my own custom definitions, but you can see here, there are 743, and this number is always changing, built-in definitions. So I would always do a quick search before you go about trying to make your own. So I'm going to search for a location, and I'm going to find, so we're good. We have a built-in allowed location. And this is going to let me limit where I want my resources to be deployed in that SC900. So I'm going to call this Japan only. And let's say we're working on a project that all of our data and all of our resources have to live in Japan. So we have that policy is enforced. And now let's set up our parameters. Our parameters, this is where we get to select where we want that resources to be limited to. So I'm going to find Japan. So we're going to say it can be in Japan East, Japan West, and the regular Japan region. So those are the only 3 locations that I'm allowed to deploy resources in now. I can also add a non-compliance message. Only Japan, let me capitalize that. All right, and so what happens if a user tries to deploy a resource outside of Japan, they're gonna get a pop-up saying only Japan regions allowed. From there, I'm gonna go ahead and select review and create and let that policy deploy. Pretty fast. And now you can see if I go back to my overview page, I have my different policies in place. Now you can see here, I'm 100% compliant. But if you notice, it's 0 out of 0, and we have that status of not started. That's because this policy hasn't ran across my subscription yet. It takes, I would say if we came back here in about 15 minutes, 30-ish minutes, it would have already ran. But one thing I want to make sure you understand is when you create a policy, it only is applying to future resources. So it's only going to prevent future resources from being deployed outside of Japan. It will not stop and it will not delete resources that are already in existence. They'll flag as non-compliant, but they'll continue to run. So if I go, and let's say, for example, I want to create a storage account. So just an Azure service, I'm going to create a new storage account. And I'll have my subscription. We're going to use my SC900 resource. All right. Oh, you can see already it has a policy violation. It's going to stop me right away because East US is not allowed. But what happens if I do Japan East? Look, it lets me there. So again, these policies are a really great way how to enforce security or compliance reasons. Let's say for your SQL databases, you want to make sure you're enabling Defender. You can enforce that via policy. So let's go ahead and hop back into the slides and look at a couple other security or governance tools inside of Azure. So let's say that you've created these policies, you've created these role-based access controls, and you want to take all these settings and apply them to another environment. Well, that's where you can use an Azure blueprint. And I want you to think of these blueprints as the same ones that architects use to design a building. Azure Blueprint allows your cloud architects to define and create a repeatable set of Azure resources that you can use to quickly build out new environments, and it's going to have all the same compliance and security standards. Now, blueprints are designed to help with the environment setup. And when you are creating an environment, you're usually going to have a set of resource groups, policies, role assignments, ARM templates. All of that goes into an environment. A blueprint is a package to bring each of these artifact types together and allow you to compose a version of that package. Now, a lot of folks tend to get policies and blueprints mixed up. A policy is a default allow-deny system that's focused on resource properties during the resource deployment and already for your existing resources. It supports your cloud governance by validating that a resource within a subscription adheres to those requirements and standards. Now, a policy can be included as one of the artifacts in your blueprint definition. Now, blueprints also support using parameters with policies and initiatives. So we've already covered the different tools inside of Azure that are designed to keep your organization safe. Now what I want to do is take a look at how you can leverage some of the different management tools to really understand your organization's security posture and where you can make improvements. So if you haven't heard of a CSPM tool or a cloud security posture management tool, that's okay. It's a relatively new type of tool that was created to help improve how you manage your cloud resources. And the way it works is by constantly scanning and checking out your systems, and then it sends alerts to your IT team anytime it finds a vulnerability. Now, the CSPM tool uses a variety of different models and tools that we've already discussed today, like zero trust and policies. But the main purpose of a CSPM tool is to provide centralized security management to your team who, may be spread across the entire organization. Think of your security team all the way up to your business leaders. And you know what? I think it's safe to say that protecting your network and ultimately your data is a lot of work, especially since attackers are always finding new ways to break into all those different layers of defense. So inside of Azure, we have something called the Azure Security Center. And it's designed to protect your workloads, whether they're inside of Azure or inside of your on-prem data center. Now, the Security Center is constantly monitoring your environments and will keep track of any type of resource when it's added or when it's removed. And on top of that, it's providing recommendations like adding different policies to better protect your data. And because it does support IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS workloads, there are additional tools in the Security Center like Defender, which we're actually going to look at in the next session. But it's always going to be looking at your environment and your entire network topology to make sure that everything is configured properly. And if not, it's going to send you an alert so you can block that unwanted traffic. At the end of the day, though, Security Center is going to help you secure your Azure resources faster and better than really you could potentially all on your own. And it's giving you that centralized insight. Now, personally, one of my favorite features inside of the Azure Security Center is that secure score. Remember those recommendations in the Security Center? Well, each of those contribute to your overall security score. For example, the Security Center has multiple recommendations for how you can secure your management ports. Now, you're going to have to remediate them all to make a difference on your secure score. So let's say, for example, the security control has apply system updates as a maximum score of 6. You can see, actually, if we have that on the screen here, you can see the potential increase value of the control. But you know what? I don't want to worry you, even if you have a long list of security recommendations, because you're not on your own. Now, you do have the choice to manually remediate all of these, but we have what's called a quick fix option on some of the recommendations. And that quick fix is going to take that recommendation and fix it for you. Now, we're going to log into the portal in a minute and to look at the Security Center, but I want to make sure you understand something about the secure score, is that these recommendations are based off of Microsoft best practices. And they are not law by any means necessary. You are under no obligation to follow them. So you need to make sure you understand what your organization needs before you go making changes. But with that said, why don't we go ahead and jump into the portal? So inside of the Azure portal, I am going to go to the Security Center. Again, you can search for it a bunch of different ways. I happen to have it handy here underneath my Azure services. So I'm going to select the Security Center. And here we go. We're on to the overview page. Now, this is going to be my secure score. You can see how many subscriptions I currently have active, how many different resources it's reviewing, and how many recommendations. Now, you can see I don't really have any major security alerts that I need to be taking care of, but let's go ahead and look at my secure score. So 72%, so I got like a C minus, but you can see I have some recommendations. So I can either select here, improve your secure score, or I can actually come over here on the left-hand side underneath general and select recommendations. Now these recommendations, you can see I have a total of 23 points available and I currently have 17. We can see, ooh, I actually have 5 unhealthy resources. So why don't we scroll down and take a look at some of those different resources. We have one right off the back that's pretty obvious. Enable multi-factor authentication. We learned about that earlier today, and enabling multi-factor authentication is going to make a big difference. Now, you can see, oh, wait, hang on. I have a max score of 10. Okay, so I'm good. Multi-factor authentication. Okay, phew, all right, I'm doing pretty good. Let's see where else I'm going. Ooh, restrict unauthorized access to my network. This is a possible 4 points. Now you can see I have some containers, some key vaults. I have some work that I can do here. So if we were to actually click in, and let's say container registry should use a private link, we can see I have some remediation steps. Now in this case, it's giving me a step-by-step instructions on how to remediate this resource that's potentially unhealthy. And you can see that it actually scanned my resources 30 minutes ago. Now remember how I told you that these are going to be recommendations? Well, if I wanted to, I can actually exempt this alert or this recommendation. Like, say for my organization, I didn't want to use the private links for whatever reason. I can exempt it. Or what I can do is I can actually enforce it by creating a policy. So this will actually redirect me to Azure policy, and then that way I can create one. That way, no matter what, when someone creates a resource, a container registry, it's going to enforce that private link. Let's see here if I have any quick fixes. Doesn't look like I have any quick fixes here. But you can see I need to enable Azure Defender, some best practices. It looks like I'm doing pretty good with best practitioners. Maximum of 3 owners. Okay, so it looks like I'm doing good, but I have some work that I need to do. So the Security Center is going to be a great place to, again, see that overall secure score, as well as, get recommendations, see your alerts. And again, you can actually filter this. So if I go back to the Security Center, I can actually filter this by different subscriptions. So let's say, for example, instead of my demo subscriptions, I wanted to use the retail production. All right. So, retail production is actually doing pretty good. That's 100% secure score. That's what I like to see. Let's see if we can find one that needs something else. Why don't we try, let's see here. Let's try the Contoso Hotels. All right. Well, it looks like my subscriptions are doing pretty good, and this is what we want to see. Even with my 76% on, let's go back to the Chelsea demo. You can see it's giving me those suggestions. And this is a great tool, especially if you're new to Azure and you want to make sure your environments are secure. Please make sure that you're taking advantage and leveraging that Security Center. So why don't we go ahead and look at one more tool inside of the slides, and that is Azure Defender. So Azure Defender is built into the Azure portal. And like I mentioned before, it automatically syncs with the Security Center to protect your environments with built-in policies that you can either use out of the box or you can customize them to meet your needs. Now, Azure Defender has a lot of different plans to help protect your servers, your applications, your storage accounts, even your databases. And anytime there's a threat inside of your environment, you're going to get an alert with suggested steps on how to remediate this threat. And these alerts can be exported into Azure Sentinel. And we're going to look at that in the next section. But here's the thing. Azure Defender isn't just for your Azure environment. It can also be used to protect your on-prem environment and even other cloud providers like AWS or GCP. And both Azure Security Center and Azure Defender have built-in baselines. And the way that works is it's based off of best practices for each service. And the whole point of these built-in baselines is to help provide security to the most common cases that your environment may encounter. Some of the controls that are used in Azure Security Benchmark include like network security, identity and access controls, data protection, data recovery, incident responses, and so much more. So this is how we're getting those baselines inside of Azure. But last section, we're going to wrap up today exploring what I think is some of the more exciting tools, and that is Azure Sentinel. Now, before I can really get into the nitty-gritty of what Azure Sentinel can do, I want to chat about 3 different acronyms that are important to understand. So let's talk with SIEM. This is a Security Incident Event Manager tool. The way it works is that it's collecting data across your entire organization, and it's constantly looking for anomalies, and it's going to alert you when one is found. SOAR, a security orchestration automated response tool, is taking your alerts from all different systems, like your SIEM tools, and then automatically triggering a workflow to run different tasks and actions that can actually stop or change a security incident. And the last one, XDR, this is a system, or it stands for Extended Detection and Response System, and it's designed to give you an integrated and automated response across your entire organization. Now, in order to truly have a secure environment, your organization needs to embrace and really implement all 3 of these different types of systems. And that's where Azure Sentinel comes in. Microsoft Azure Sentinel is a SIEM and SOAR solution that delivers security, analytics, and threat intelligence across your entire enterprise. So I want you to imagine Azure Sentinel like a bird's eye view watching over all of your workloads, whether it's Azure or Office 365. And it's looking out for threats or kind of like weird behaviors, and it sees it before you even knew they existed. And the way it does this is by using all the data that's been collected by Microsoft over the years around security and potential threats, and it was used to train a machine learning model that's kind of the brains behind Sentinel. Now, because of all of the different connectors that are available, it can make it so you can review logs and alerts for all your different products, and it allows you to see correlations between your different threats. Now, there's 4 main categories that the job of Sentinel falls into. So the first one is to collect data. This data is collected from users, devices, applications, whether it's on-prem or in your cloud environment. And it allows the AI to know what is normal and what's not. And you can review the logs, again, across the entire organization in a single spot. Next, it's detecting real threats and it's investigating them, but it's cutting back on those false alarms. Because once you get that alert, you can use the built-in orchestration to create an automatic response to those threats. And on the main dashboard, you can see all of your alerts and incidents in your environment. And I mean, this includes, but it's definitely not limited to, active incidents and their statuses, trends across environments and incident data sources, different anomalies, different detected attacks. And it's using the Microsoft Threat Intelligence, and it's placing it all on a single map for you to see. Now, if you have an IoT device, Azure Sentinel provides a solution to combine your IoT security data with other data across your environment for intelligent threat detection and response. You can also integrate telemetry from Azure IoT Hub and manage deployments directly into Azure Sentinel. And once you've collected your data sources to Azure Sentinel, you'll want to be notified when something suspicious occurs. And Azure Sentinel, well, it has out-of-the-box built-in templates for detecting those attacks and alerting you when any type of suspicious activity happens. Now, any of these templates, you have total control of customizing them to fit your needs. And, we have the out-of-the-box ones that are there to help you create incidents to whether it's engaging your security team, but they can also run automated playbooks to take additional actions to remediate these incidents. Now, with the Azure Sentinel workbooks, again, this is organizing and communicating that data insights. So workbooks are, again, an out-of-the-box data solution that allows you to monitor or really learn about the important metrics or trends in your environment. Azure Sentinel provides a gallery of these workbooks that will instantly help out your security team's productivity. And really, workbooks make it easier for everyone in your organization. It takes that machine data and it's turning it into really powerful insights. And Azure Sentinel, it's built on the foundations, whether it's Azure Monitor, Log Analytics. And Log Analytics, fun fact for you, it's actually ingesting more than 10 petabytes of data every single day. And Azure Sentinel lets you create advanced alert rules that generate incidents that you can assign and investigate. An incident can include multiple alerts, and it's an aggregation of all of the relevant evidence for a specific investigation. And then once an incident is created, it's based on the analytic rules that you created in your analytics page. If you're using playbooks, your analysts can actually automate the response and remediation, and it makes it more efficient and it makes the job easier to do. So the right automated incident response can actually help accelerate your incident response process. And ultimately, this is going to reduce headaches across the entire organization. If I had to summarize everything that I just went over, Azure Sentinel is your friend. But that actually brings us to the end of the first half of Module 3, and it wraps up our content for today. In this module, we dug into some of those security tools and the defenses available to protect your company's digital estate. You discovered the key security operation areas that Azure Sentinel supports and how it integrates with your existing security systems. Now, while that's everything I have for you today, please make sure that you are joining us back here for Part 2, where we'll continue the second half of Module 3 and Module 4. And since we've built a solid foundation with some of the concepts we've discussed today, we're going to focus more on Microsoft 365 and the tools that are available there to help your security team. But if you just can't wait and you wanted to get a sneak preview of the content to come, well, you can review those topics from today as well as everything else at that free learning path at aka.ms/scfunpath. And if you are planning on taking the exam, I don't want you to worry too much with the Azure portal. Instead, I want you to focus more on identifying and describing the concepts. Between this session and the learning path, you'll be good to go. So I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Give yourself a chance to digest the content we covered, and I'll see you back here for the rest of SC900 in Part 2. Bye, everyone.